um, joining us here. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started in just a second here. We have a really great presentation, and we have an author with us today, a contributor, which I'm always super excited to have, Kyle. We'll do some intros in just a second, but while people are joining us, I do want to give just a little shout out to an agent session that we're doing a workshop. Really, it starts on September 10th. It's a 6 session event. It's going to be running weekly. We're going to have some really awesome guests joining us. Like we'll have Jerry from Mama Index joining. We'll have a slide when we start presenting for y'all to get information, and we're dropping the link in the chat. But yeah, if you're interested in learning more about agents, you want to learn how to build with these agentic workflows. You want to learn how to evaluate them. It's going to be a really great session for you. So definitely invite y'all to register and save your spot to join us. But with that, I think Kyle, we can jump into it.
Certainly. I'll go ahead and present my screen. Can you all see my slides?
Yeah, it's great.
Fantastic. Hey, folks. My name is Kyle, and I'm really excited to be speaking with y'all today. Thanks, Sally Ann and Sarah, for the invites.
Of
I'm
course.
a applied scientist at Microsoft and a community researcher at Eleuther AI. I'm going to be today talking about this research direction that some collaborators and I recently proposed and wrote a paper on, uh, discussing this problem setting of composable interventions for language models. We're going through talking about some of the high level insights from our paper, trying to have as few tables in the slides as possible, but we're only really going to be scratching the surface. So I recommend if folks want a good primer on this work to check out the Twitter thread that I wrote, and then if that piques your interest, jump into the paper itself.
Awesome.
Do you want to pitch
Yeah,
any
so
more about this, Eliane?
this is the AI agent workshop that I was mentioning before. The link is in the channel there. And for anybody, I'm Sally Ann. I'll be joining Kyle here. I'm a AI product manager here at Arize. So really excited. I think this research paper is really awesome. I always love a paper that is something that's actually actionable, something that can help, all the community members and people who are in industry here. So I'm really excited to drop in. We love these to be interactive as always. So if you have questions for Kyle or you want us to elaborate on anything, feel free to drop questions either in the chat or the Q&A. I know I certainly have some, Kyle. So with that, I'll leave it to you to get us started.
Certainly. I don't know if I'll be able to keep an eye on the chat, but if Sally Ann or Sarah, if one of you could interrupt me if any interesting questions come up, that'd
Totally.
be
I'll,
great.
I'll keep eyes for you and I'll let you know if we have something to discuss.
Fabulous. Sounds good. So language models are really fantastic. I know that's not quite what the title of my slide says, but I think just to give credit where it's due, the capabilities we've seen, or really in the advancement of capabilities velocity, is really remarkable. I've had professors only a few years ago telling me that, oh, with deep learning, maybe you can get strong capabilities in one domain, but you can't have a model that's good at multiple tasks. However, that turns out not to be the case. If you can just scale, get really good at predicting the next token, you learn all these other capabilities that are instrumentally valuable, like translation, summarization, arithmetic, poetry, and so on. But even though we've seen these rapid advances and models are only getting more capable, there's still some foundational problems which don't obviously seem like they're being improved with scale. If in some cases they actually become worse with scale. And while there's still many limitations with language models that researchers and practitioners are working hard to solve, this work, at least how I kind of think about them, is it broadly can fall into these three categories. Although there are some others that don't fit quite as nicely that are beyond the scope of our work. But first off, and perhaps the most top of mind for people, is language models are expensive, both to train, that's well understood even for a relatively small model that maybe is only a few billion parameters, which maybe a couple of years ago would have been considered a very large model as well. But even if you have your 3 or 8 million parameter model, that can still require significant amounts of money in the form of compute to train and even to run inference as well, especially in a high throughput setting where you maybe need to have multiple instances of your model hosted and have high uptime, etc. So models are expensive in terms of their resources, generally regardless of how you're using them. Additionally, at least the kind of parametric knowledge that models have, what they learn from training about the world, this can be incorrect or outdated, especially if we're hosting our model in production in a setting where the, the world's changing and it needs to be able to provide update information, especially in democracies. For example, the leaders of countries change fairly frequently. So, if you ask who's the leader of so-and-so country, it might give an outdated answer. We have these knowledge cutoff dates with many of the most capable models. Or what the model has learned is perhaps information that was incorrect even at the time of training. So models' factual knowledge can be incorrect, outdated, and this can be a con for deploying models or present a challenge for practitioners that want to provide a strong and safe user experience. Additionally, and perhaps more speculatively, this is getting increasing interest in research lately, is models perhaps can be unsafe. And this can take many forms, both in terms of more well understood harms, more related to, say, responsible AI, such as many of these are well understood, such as bias, kind of propagating existing harms that are perhaps learned from training data sets and can lead to, again, subpar and unsafe user experiences. Models mayhaps could also learn dangerous capabilities or dual use knowledge, such as if you train a model on all the internet, it may learn some useful information around how maybe offensive cybersecurity or other perhaps dangerous capabilities. Or even more prosaic settings, your model may be trained on copyright information that the legal provenance has changed since training, such that you want the model to forget this training data, or it's trained on individual user information that you may want the model to forget. These all can, while these kind of takes a form of many harms, this can maybe broadly be thought of as the model's unsafe or unaligned with the operator's values. So it's unclear if kind of just scaling is going to solve all of these problems. Even in some cases, especially with maybe the expensive part, that's only going to be getting more expensive. So this kind of leads to a mitigations that have been studied and beginning to be deployed in industry that I broadly refer to as post-training interventions or interventions. So for the previous concerns, you could perhaps retrain your model from scratch. In the expensive case, you could perhaps distill your model into a smaller version using like a student-teacher type of setup. For outdated factual knowledge and for safety, perhaps you can identify the parts of your training data set that is leading to this undesirable behavior and modify your data set such that when you retrain the model, your model now has, say, the updated factual information or is no longer exhibiting the unaligned or unsafe behavior. But this identifying what's wrong with training data sets can be a challenge in its own right. But more importantly, this is an expensive, time-consuming process that is beyond the reach of many practitioners, especially if maybe you're leveraging a pre-trained model produced by another organization or produced by others and adapting it to your domain. Chances are you can't retrain them yourself, for example, even if you have the training data sets available. So with this kind of universal problem, these kind of post-training interventions are looking to solve them by making comparatively lightweight modifications to your model to address these different concerns. So some common techniques across the three different categories of interventions that we studied in this work is model editing. If you maybe heard of the Eiffel Towers in Rome kind of papers and things like that, these are updating the model's factual knowledge by making relatively surgical modifications to the model, perhaps by doing some very lightweight fine tuning or modifying the model's internals in a more interpretability inspired approach. So model editing, maybe largely focusing on use in the literature now on updating this factual knowledge. Then there is unlearning, which I kind of alluded to many of the challenges here in discussing safety earlier. Perhaps you want the model to forget something for one reason or another. Unlearning techniques originally motivated by a lot of privacy concerns, so there's right to be forgotten laws. But these are getting increasing interest as well. Since language models are really good at learning stuff, but sometimes they're learning things that you don't necessarily want them to have learned. And then lastly, and this is the most widely applied set of interventions in industry today, is compression. These are perhaps the most battle tested, with quantization being the most common one. These take your model and modify them to be more resource efficient. So they take up, uh, require less VRAM during inference. And there's even been some efforts to be able to train or fine-tune models reliably while also being compressed. The trick here is that you reduce um, compute requirements while preserving overall performance. So these are all interventions that have been studied commonly in the literature and are beginning to slowly but surely be more deployed in practice. However, a limitation in how interventions are studied today is they're largely studied in isolation. If you have a paper or a blog post often talking about some new model editing or quantization technique, the convention is to that only apply that intervention to your model and no other interventions. This makes sense from a scientific standpoint in that you really want to isolate the causal effect that applying your intervention has on model performance. If you're working on a new quantization technique, you might want to say, oh, I can lower the bits to this level and that still preserve overall performance more than baseline techniques. But a practical dimension that is neglected in the current literature is this need for interventions to be composable. So if you think of these kind of three axes of maybe concerns one might have when deploying your model. You would want your model to be resource efficient, but perhaps you also want it to be able to update your model's factual knowledge and forget other knowledge um, without retraining from scratch. So you might want to be applying more than one intervention to your model. You might be applying multiple. And the interactions between interventions um, is understudied. You would want your interventions to be order invariant in that if you apply, it doesn't quite matter the order of the interventions which you do apply. It shouldn't matter that much for an intervention to be maximally composable and practical, whether you edit first and then compress or compress and then do unlearning after. This can be useful if you perhaps don't know ahead of time which interventions you're going to apply. And we don't want applying interventions sequentially to regress overall performance or the performance of these interventions on their particular metrics, such as if we, besides measuring overall performance, if we apply some edits to the model, we don't want to then have a subsequent intervention undo or corrupt those edits. And this is the problem that we study in our work, is for these popular interventions studied in the literature across model editing, unlearning, and compression, how composable are popular interventions? And that this is an important requirement for them to be, especially for editing and learning, move beyond a academic interest and be actually techniques that practitioners can apply. So I guess I began to touch on this in my previous slide. But this is the research question that we broadly study in our work. For the techniques that we study, for editing, we study the popular Mehmet model editing technique, along with some fine-tuning based approaches, full parameter fine-tuning in LoRa. For data sets, we use some popular question answer data set in the model editing literature, and we use various editing metrics. For compression, we study two types of compression. We study weight pruning, where you learn how to make your model more sparse so have a larger number of its weights set to zero while still maintaining overall performance, and quantization, where we reduce the precision of our model's weights, which takes up less compute, and is perhaps the most popular compression techniques. And then for unlearning, we studied two popular unlearning techniques, gradient ascent, where we essentially flip the loss function and try to make the model minimize the likelihood of the correct token on a different or on some unlearning distribution. And then we study a technique that I'm a big fan of, representation misdirection for unlearning, or RMVO. And this is a recently introduced unlearning technique that intervenes on the model's activations at a given layer, which I'll discuss a little bit more in subsequent slides. But to measure overall performance, despite as well as these intervention-specific metrics, we largely use MMLU. There's many different ways to measure overall model performance. That's one of actually another open questions in language modeling is what does it mean for a model to be like capable? But in our case, we largely focus on MMLU. And all of our interventions are applied to llama 3 8 billion as our main model choice.
I'd love to hear a little bit more just on those metrics there. Just curious, and you might be getting to this later, but is there a way we could think about this of how these composability metrics align with any of our like real world performance requirements? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Certainly. So when thinking about composability, um, order invariance can be thought of as kind of like reducing maybe headaches for practitioners. It's easier to use interventions if they don't need to be applied in a particular order.
Hmm.
Say maybe you don't know ahead of time all the interventions you want to apply to your model. Perhaps you deploy your model, and then 3 months later, some new requirement comes up where you need to update its factual knowledge. Maybe you don't know ahead of time that that's going to happen. So you
Hmm.
want to choose a compression, but you're going to compress your model right out of the gate, right when you deploy it. Perhaps you want to choose a model that, or sorry, choose a compression technique that's been shown to be more order invariant with other interventions, but keep your options open. So you don't need to maybe retrain your model or do all of your compression again from scratch. And in technique, in this, I don't go into the equations that much in this presentation, but this is for folks who are interested. I recommend diving into the paper and the Twitter thread. For order free error, this is largely focusing on just what's the maximum performance that you can get when you pair two interventions. And then you can compare that against performance if you didn't apply any interventions or you apply only one, because you don't want to maybe let's say you have your original model, you apply some editing, but then you apply quantization, and that reduces overall performance. Or maybe your top level performance, maybe measured by MLU, remains the same, but your editing performance goes down. That order-free error will track that drop in your editing performance.
Makes a
So
lot of
it's just kind
sense.
of like it's some fairly simple formulas. They're a useful way to think about how performance along different axes changes when you begin composing multiple interventions together. And that can help you choose maybe which order of interventions to apply or which specific interventions maybe you shouldn't apply.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Certainly. Now I'm going to start going to maybe 7 of the main points or findings that my collaborators and I have our takeaways from conducting this work. There's a lot of graphs and line charts. I won't analyze all individually. I recommend folks going to go to the Twitter thread or the paper. We want to look at a lot of the performance of these individual interventions. But I'm going to talk about, while there's some variance across the specific interventions we study, and that's one of the findings that we found interesting. I'm going to largely in this presentation talk about our kind of meta themes or heuristics that we found. So we start with pairing editing and compression. And for our experience, we generally do these comparing two different classes of interventions together. So when we begin, we're looking at editing and compression. What we generally found was that compression can degrade model editing performance, especially at more aggressive levels of compression. Well, so points one and two are pretty similar. But for weight pruning, what we found was that it's generally better to apply your edits after you prune your model. And to a similar extent, but less so with quantization. What we find is that if you edit first and then compress afterwards, this these compression algorithms tend to undo or corrupt the previously successful edits. Um, this is for folks who are very interested in the model editing part of this, this is interesting because this perhaps shows that edits aren't, in some sense, robustly or deeply modifying the model. So that if you modify your model just a little bit with compression, that can begin to undo your edits. So this shows that with the model editing literature, that may show a very strong editing performance if you only apply their editor. If you then further modify your model, then those edits become undone. So editing and compression, if you're doing aggressive levels of compression, such as if you're maybe pruning more than a quarter of your model or compressing below 8 bits or quantizing below 8 bits, then if you are going to be editing as well, you should be editing after you do your compression. And composability can vary have some variance by the particular techniques within your class of interventions. So what we find is that quantization is a bit more composable than a weight pruning. And between GPTQ and AWQ, the two types of quantization techniques that we study, they compare, there can be some variance across which performs better at more extreme levels of compression in terms of top level performance, but also their composability. And that MLU, or like this kind of overall model performance, doesn't seem to really track these challenges of composability. Performance will remain fairly steady, even if we see cases where compressing or editing first and then compressing like the undoing edits, and that there is imperfect composability. And this is a kind of lends more credence to the idea that it's useful to have composability driven metrics. Next, we next study unlearning and compression, where we find a similar effect that compression and unlearning can have challenges composing well together, but we find the ordering to be opposite. Interestingly, what we find here is that in contrast to editing, it's better to apply unlearning before you do compression. There's something about these unlearning algorithms that we study that are some of the most popular in the literature, that it's more difficult to modify the knowledge of a already compressed model. And while this hasn't been proven in the literature or studied rigorously, it does seem not particularly surprising that maybe if you compress a model, its knowledge is maybe in some sense more compressed in a way that makes it harder to modify with these post-training techniques. So that's something to keep in mind when applying compression is if you compress your model, modifying it afterwards, it might be more brittle in some sense, even if its overall performance metrics without any modifications remain strong. And that in unlearning, we found to be one of the clear cases of order sensitivity or order invariance being important. So two of the three unlearning techniques performed quite well. Gradient difference in RMU. Gradient difference, in that work, it extends gradient descent, where you're trying to minimize the likelihood of the correct token on some unlearning distribution. So this is like the opposite of our regular loss function. But with gradient difference, we have an additional regularization term. We're also trying to maximize the correct token on some unrelated distribution. What we generally find is for unlearning, the RMU and gradient difference have similar unlearning success, but gradient difference is more sensitive, far more sensitive to ordering than RMU. So this suggests that in this case here, while they both are equally good on learners, largely, RMU modifies the model in a way such that its unlearning is more robust to additional interventions being applied. And then our last main set of results is with editing and unlearning. And this one, we're pairing the editors like fine-tuning, LoRa, and Nemet with our unlearning techniques, gradient descent, gradient difference, and RMU. And a result that was I was especially interested in was, which hasn't been cited yet, is can you modify a model's knowledge with like different techniques or from different, I don't know, directions, I suppose. These editing techniques are modifying a model's like factual knowledge by making very targeted fine tunes generally, so this is where updating like the answers to specific questions. Whereas with the unlearning techniques we studied, we're trying to forget a broad distribution of knowledge. In our case, we were evaluating unlearning on the weapons of mass destruction proxy dataset, which is focusing on making the model forget a broad set of knowledge that can be potentially dangerous or a proxy for dangerous knowledge, such as information about epidemics or how to do hacking. So in this one, we're not trying to forget maybe specific facts necessarily, but rather a broad distribution of knowledge. And we find that editing and unlearning can be quite composable, but it depends on the technique. With RMU, it's quite composable, with the order invariance being unimportant. For gradient difference and gradient descent, we find that similar to before, you can achieve a strong unlearning performance, but the order sensitivity is much more important, or it's more sensitive to ordering, which makes me makes me excited about some of these representation engineering type techniques, which RMU is an early example of, where we're modifying instead of fine tuning a model in the end, we're choosing a specific layer and trying to steer its representations or activations in some way to kind of steer model behavior. It's an interesting technique that I recommend folks check out, RMU, part of the WMDC paper. How are we doing on time?
We
Okay.
got about 15 minutes here.
Okay, so we should have plenty of time for questions from folks. Sounds great. So I think for the broad takeaways, we're only scratching the surface on this direction. And one of the kind of main points we're interested in is galvanizing interest in studying composability when we're introducing new interventions in the literature, because this is an important requirement for making interventions practical to use in production, which is ultimately where we want them to be if we're going to realize the positive impact. I'll talk more about my maybe manifesto on this in a subsequent slide. But for our empirical results, what we broadly find is that compression, this most popular class of interventions, aggressive compression, which there's more and more interest in, is more struggles to compose well with other interventions. So while the field is beginning to look at more aggressive forms of compression, like 4-bit quantization, higher degrees of sparsity, it's important to understand that while yes, this may reduce your maybe GPU footprint, it also may tie your hands more in terms of what other modifications you can make to your model. Editing and unlearning generally compose well. We can modify a model's kind of knowledge base in some sense using different techniques. But the specific techniques, but in terms of order sensitivity, specific techniques matter. And while this is like a useful kind of sanity check, overall performance doesn't really capture things like maximum composed error for our intervention specific metrics or order sensitivity. So while you still want to, whenever you're making a new intervention or any sort of modifications to your model, have really robust overall performance evals, metrics like your edit success or unlearning success, these are intervention specific metrics, you'll need to measure those as well, along with your overall model capabilities. So this is kind of the first of what we think can be a quite fruitful direction for practitioners and researchers to look into for making interventions more practical. Some kind of specific directions that my collaborators and I are thinking about for you also be excited for other folks to look into is expanding our scope of interventions. There's many proposed in the literature, and more seems like every week or so I see some new interesting paper come out. So expanding the set of interventions that we do study. Um, a limitation of our work is that we only focused on normatively 8 billion. And while this is I'd argue a fairly representative model, because since it's amongst the most capable at its parameter count, there could be some factor where our results may not generalize across model families. We have run some initial experiments as a part of our NeurIPS reviews, where we have studied Mistral 7 billion, so quite a similar model, and find that our results seem to generalize, but the more work is needed along this direction. What I'm especially interested in is maybe scaling laws for composability. As models become larger, how do these factors change? Maybe it could be that if you have a really capable 100 billion parameter model, that even when you do aggressively compress it, maybe it's large enough such that modifying its compressed knowledge is easy in a way that bringing a billion model it might not be. This is largely an empirical question that currently remains unstudied. And then lastly, we've only studied pairs of two interventions in this work, largely through the practical reason of the combinatorial explosion of we have a dozen or so interventions. You make all the pairings together. Each one typically requires like an hour on an A100. It's challenging to do a wide set of experiments with increasing the cardinality of your maybe set of interventions. They're trying to see if you're maybe applying 3 or 4 or 5 different classes of interventions, how does that affect performance? And all this together can be broadly kind of characterized, and maybe my motivation for this work, if I had to sum it up, would be kind of these interventions are a really exciting way to make models better in a way that doesn't require retraining. None of us want to retrain models. Even the folks who know how to do it don't want to. But much more work is needed to make them practical. We have seen success with compression and interventions being widely used. I think it's possible for other interventions, such as editing and unlearning, to be just as practical. It'd be really great if we could just super easy modify our model's knowledge or to answers to questions without having to do complicated fine tuning. But much more work is needed. And it would be really awesome if we could get this to work. I think it would go a long way towards making models more aligned with their operators and easier to control and adapt to a greater variety of use cases. And then this work was a fantastic collaboration. There were a lot of folks in this team, but the principal folks were Aaron Bjorn Tangen, one of my fellow lead authors. Um, and then Tom Harpidson at the University of Virginia was the main PI on this work. But we were part of a broader team, including the folks from Harvard, Oxford, and University of North Carolina. And they're all really, I recommend checking out their work. They're all really talented researchers. If you're really interested in editing, like model editing, I recommend checking out Tom Hartvigson's work. If you're interested in compression, especially pruning, Tianjin's work is really good. So these are folks definitely to keep on your radar. And yeah, I'm happy to kind of open up the floor and answer any more questions. If folks are interested in chatting about any of this work or other things, or find some of my this direction interesting, hit me up on Twitter or check out my website or available on email, LinkedIn, all those other directions as well. But yeah, thanks for the invite, and I'm curious to hear what folks think.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an awesome paper. I really like that slide where you have kind of the three bullet points on like what's next. That was actually going to be my one of my questions, but you got ahead of me of what's next, what's the future of this work here. We do have a few questions in the channel that I want to get to. But I think one thing that I think we should wrap up with is like, do you have any advice for, practitioners looking to kind of implement any of these findings in their own deployments?
Certainly. Let's see. I think maybe to narrow the question a little bit, it would be while our work does provide some heuristics, in general, if you're going to use edit, if you're going to be compressing your model, but you think you want to also do editing, it's better to compress first and then edit and things like that. Um, Really, these are kind of recommendations based off of the model that we studied and the interventions. As with so many things in kind of machine learning or language modeling research, it might vary across scale and across mock training regimes. So when in doubt, just have really good evals. And this is like a
Mm,
broad machine learning heuristic, especially with my like more applied work that I do at Microsoft. Just make sure you have really good evals for whatever you're interested in, because there's very little in the way of theory and heuristics you can rely upon when working with language models. So if you're interested in applying a set of interventions, our work can provide some tips, but I would still recommend having really good evals and just experiment with different combinations yourself.
really great answer. Cool. All right. So some of the questions in the chat, we have one from Matt, asking if we could dive in, or I guess drive home the interpretation of the surprising effect that, editing after pruning hurts the performance while unlearning a pruned model, also hurts performance. Any thoughts on that?
Certainly. But a limitation of our work is that we're largely, maybe to use a $5 word, phenomenological, in that we look at how applying interventions affects these top level metrics, but we don't dive deeply into looking exactly what properties of the different interventions are causing specific behavior. Um, that's something I'm really interested in personally, but was just beyond the scope of this work. But if I had to conjecture, um, I don't know. This is like definitely mostly just like half-baked thoughts that like collaborators and I have. But it might be that this is very half-baked, but it could be that the way that other research has found in model editing that the edits made to models seem to be fragile in some sense.
Mm,
Um, like if you like a popular editing technique that really galvanized a lot of interest in model editing was the Rome technique. And this is a great paper by David Bau's lab. He's a fantastic interpretability researcher. Also has a lot of great podcasts. I recommend checking out their lab. But they were looking at things like, can you change the Eiffel model to think that the Eiffel Tower is not in Paris, but rather in Rome? And you can do that by they're doing some very targeted fine tunes to the internals of the model. But that if you rephrase the question sufficiently, or you ask some like logical, I guess like follow-up questions, then the edits kind of break, or they don't seem to really deeply modify the model's knowledge in some vague sense. So it could be the case that if you make these not really deep in some sense modifications to the model, and then you do something like pruning, where you're setting all the weights to zero, um, this maybe could be considered a fairly drastic modification of the model's internals, even if the top line performance is maintained. Maybe that shuffles the model's knowledge in a way that undoes these lightweight edits. As for why unlearning is robust to this, by contrast, I don't super know. Um, so yeah, I
I
think it
guess
just goes
that's
to
another
show,
research topic.
yes, it just goes to show this is very much like on the frontier. But that's a great question, man.
All right. Awesome. Yeah, they appreciate the answer. They think it's a good showcasing of your thought process here. We have another one coming in. It looks like it says in July, a paper was published on Nature magazine about how models collapse when trained on recursively generated data. So models could be trained on data generated artificially, unknown to the developers, and that has not factually correct or updated data. They gradually degrade in quality before collapsing and start to, generate nonsense. Could these interventions help combat these kinds of issues? Which ones that you mentioned do you think would be suitable to kind of tackle this issue?
That's interesting. If I understood the question correctly, it's this idea that as more and more of the internet becomes AI generated, which is a
Yeah,
weird world to live in. Let's
super
just
meta.
take a step back and remember this. But anyways, it future models are going to be trained on more and more AI generated data. And there's been some research that suggests that if you train models on AI generated data, you get some sort of collapse where models begin to get worse. It could be the case that maybe if you have some sort of model editing work where you want to preserve the model's ability to answer these factual questions, that you could apply editing after you've done your training on additional AI generated data. And that causes the model's factual knowledge to update and be aligned with what you want it to say. Um, Notwithstanding the point I alluded to in the previous answer, where model editing seems in its current form to have limitations, um, that could be one way. I On that note about the recursive training and collapse, without being expert on it, my sense that it's still an open question. Um, since you might be training on a mixture of AI generated and human text. And funnily enough, a big research direction in the leading labs right now is how can we create synthetic data? Like we're running out of data on the internet. How can we create new data using an AI to train another AI on that? So funnily enough, being able to train future generations of model, so maybe we train GPT-5 on GPT-4's data, for example, something like that,
Yeah.
um, is something that's a big open question right now. But a lot of people are trying to get it to work right. So that's another cool research direction is synthetic data and how training on that affects the like robustness of your model.
Yeah. I think synthetic data is a really hot research topic. I think as this problem they're describing becomes more and more prevalent, it's needed that we have some kind of way to combat that. So I'll definitely be watching. Um, I guess we have 2 minutes. I guess I'll squeak in one last question here. So obviously this industry, everything is evolving so fast. How do you feel like we can ensure that, these interventions remain relevant and effective? Do you think we just have to kind of stay on top of what's latest, continue to push research forward, or do you think there's some methods that will kind of withstand this rapid evolution?
Oh, I guess like the maybe the kind of rational and mature answer would be nobody knows. Um, like anyone who makes my hot take is anyone who really tries to make confident predictions about the
Hmm.
future is selling moonshine and reminds me of my professors who were so confident that deep learning would never give you
Hmm.
general capabilities. But maybe in terms of practices that stand the test of time is I mentioned it before, have really good evals. If
Hmm.
you're trying to measure your performance on some task, um, make sure you have a really good measurement regime in place. And also understand that maybe if you have some model that's deployed in production that takes in new data over time, understand that your distributions might shift. I was previously at my work at Microsoft doing a lot of ML for like hate speech detection in the news
Mm.
domain. And in news, and hate speech and other forms of toxicity or being harmful content. And in the news domain of all things, is especially extreme since you have black swan events and the news constantly changing. This
Mm.
was kind of like the distribution shifts on steroids in some sense. And what was really helpful for us is just have really good measurement. If the nature of your distribution is changing, you can't guarantee that your model will generalize to that new distribution.
Totally.
So try to measure that ahead of time. Um, that's kind of like the maybe where my intuitions are today on that question, at least how I think about the future.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Things are moving so fast, so I guess we'll see. But Kyle, thank you so much for joining us. This was a super interesting paper. Like Kyle said, feel free to take a look at his Twitter thread, dive into the paper. I think there's a lot of really helpful stuff here. And just thank you again, Kyle, for joining us. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been really fantastic chatting with everyone. Yeah, again, feel free to hit me up online if you're interested in any of these directions or some of the other work I'm looking into. I forgot to do it at the top, but also big shout out to Eluther AI as an open source research community. They're how I got into research, and I'm involved with some of their projects. So if you're interested in at least just a very fun Discord of people who are really on the cutting edge of research and sharing papers and talking about stuff, I recommend checking out or getting involved in open source research. I recommend reaching out or taking a look at the Eleuther AI Discord.
Yeah, awesome stuff. I know I'll definitely be taking a look. Well, that's it, everyone, for today. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one.